All right, and we are starting live. Welcome to our roundtable food labeling information for the sustainable food system. Today's roundtable is organized by the Green REV Institut and Future Food for Climate Coalition that brings together CSOs, activists, and scientific communities. Together we work on advocacy, watchdog, and campaigning, knowledge sharing, and stakeholder mobilization. So in September 2023, the European Commission is expected to present a proposal for the sustainable food system. And one of the pillars of the sustainable food system law is to be food labeling, the right to consumers to transparent information on where food comes from, how its production affects the climate, biodiversity, public health, and of course, animal rights. At the round table, we're going to discuss good practices in labeling, demands, challenges, and of course, opportunities for the food system repair. Firstly, I would like to thank our speakers for your time and participation in today's event. Today with us, we have outstanding speakers representing European Parliament, civil society organizations, and business. And I will briefly introduce each of our guests. MEP Manuela Ripa, German lawyer and member of the European Parliament. She represents the German Ecological Democratic Party in the group of the Greens EFA. Her focus lies on the areas of biodiversity, animal welfare, climate, and consumer protection. She's full member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy and substitute member of both the ENVI and INTA committee. She's co-chair of the Companion Animals Working Group and vice president of the Intergroup on Animal Welfare and in the European Parliament. We have with us Olga Kiku, head of Compassion in World Farming EU, an international organization dedicated to improving farm animal welfare and the industrial animal agriculture and achieving sustainable food and farming. She is involved in advocacy work at the EU level on key interests concerning the interlinked areas of animal welfare, food and farming, raising the profile of these issues on the policy sphere. Dr. Joanna Swape, Senior Director of the Public Affairs in Humane Society International Europe. She oversees the development and implementation of Humane Society International's animal protection policies in the European Union. Her primary task is to encourage the EU institutions to achieve legislative change and to get a wide variety of animal protection issues on the agenda of the EU policymakers. Ronja Berthold, Head of Public Affairs of the European Vegetarian Union. Ronja holds a master's degree in non-profit management and public governance. Her expert knowledge includes vegan and vegetarian food labeling, as well as agricultural and food policies in Germany and the EU. Alice Di Concetto, founder of the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy, think tank specializing in EU animal law and policies, where she provides services to the EU-based animal protection, non-profits and public administrations, lecturer in the European animal law at the Sorbonne Law School and Sciences Po Law School, Paris, France. Axel Anders lives and works in Berlin as a co-founder of the Adolf Hoops Society, the international standard and label organization for biocyclic vegan agriculture. He is primarily involved in the international development of the biocyclic vegan activities. Peran Harvey leads global policy and public affairs at Upfield, the world's largest plant-based food company. He focuses on advocacy and campaigning around achieving a level regulatory playing field for plant-based food to support a transition that puts plant-based food at the heart of the sustainable, healthy, and equitable food system. So without further delay, I would like to open the roundtable and address the first question to MEP Manuela Ripa. Manuela Ripa, you are one of the most active and hardworking members of the European Parliament in the context of food labeling. What specific proposals would you like to see introduced in the European Union regulation? And can this happen before the 2024 election? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to this very timely and important event. Nowadays, we'll find more and more products in the shelves of our supermarket, all promising a great deal of things, especially of being healthy, sustainable, or animal welfare friendly. But often looking more closely to the product, this is not at all the case. Just take the example of laughing cartoon pigs or cows on a meat product, not revealing that the meat derives from factory farming. Certainly, no animal was happy there. And consumers are asking more and more for reliable information about the product they buy. They are more and more interested where the product comes from and how the product is affecting the climate, biodiversity, their own health, or animal welfare. And I would say this is a very good news to have this new consciousness in large part of consumers. But often the wanted information is not clear or understandably labeled, or even worse, you need to be a chemist to understand the ingredients list. And a lot of studies show that consumers prefer to buy with labels than without, and they're willing to pay even more for these products. But when it comes to front-of-pack nutrition labeling, the EU already tried once to introduce such a label, but in the end failed as it was not mandatory. It was the case of Nutri-Score. I think that Nutri-Score has a high potential to deliver necessary information to consumers that the consumer is looking for, and that can help him or her to make more informed, more balanced and healthier food choices. And this is definitely needed in our society that is getting more and more obese with increased risk of multiple chronic health conditions such as diabetes burdening our health system. And this is why I'm happy that the Commission now wants to come up with a new proposal on Nutri-Score. But this time the proposal needs to be right from the start, trying to correct the mistakes from the last proposal. And Nutri-Score definitely had some deficiencies. Just let me tell you some examples. For example, the degree of processed food was not taken into account. So for example, a Coke Light got a B, but an apple juice that has a lot of fruit sugar got a C. And another problem of Nutri-Score was that additives like sweeteners need to be taken more into account. Natural ingredients need to get better scores than those that are replaced by sweeteners, as it is now the case. And definitely the label should not apply to single ingredient products when there's the danger of misleading, like we have it now where an olive oil gets a C and again a Diet Coke gets a B. Then definitely there you will never get the Mediterranean countries accepting Nutri-Score. And last example that I would like to make is about frozen products that need to be tackled differently. It cannot be that a frozen French fry gets an A, but once you will bring it at home and process it there, it's definitely not an A anymore. So I just made these examples to show you that is all extremely confusing to our citizens and differs from the goal of labels to make their decision informed and as simple as possible. Moreover, in order to empower consumers, and I believe strongly in the empowered consumer, that means making it easier for him or her to do the right choices, we also need sometimes legally binding definitions. Just take the example of the term vegan or vegetarian. I'm sure we will hear later more about it. Neither at European nor at member state level, there are clear and legally binding definitions for the food sector. And as a result, companies develop their own label and even worse, their own criteria, which vary from company to company. And this does not help the consumer at all and can be highly misleading. But front-of-pack nutrition labeling is not the only proposal I would like to see introduced when new rules for labeling are proposed. Another very important proposal needs to be addressed as soon as possible. And this is, we need an EU-wide mandatory animal welfare label in order to avoid misleading the consumer about animal welfare. Just take my example at the beginning with the smiling cows and pigs, when there certainly was nothing to smile about. A mandatory multi-tier label for all animal-derived food products is a topic that is really very close to my heart. For years, me and my party, the Ecologic Democratic Party, have been calling for the introduction of a mandatory animal welfare label that would include, and this is very important, pictures of the husbandry conditions. Together with my predecessor in the parliament, Klaus Buchner, I've developed the concept of an EU-wide label with which I'm actively promoting since then. My concept foresees that, first of all, it should be clearly shown on meat packaging how the animals are kept. Pictures have an effect and strongly influence consumer behavior. And I'm strongly convinced that like this, we can get rid of irresponsible mass industrialization of meat faster than politics will ever decide. Moreover, not only pictures, but also the use of antibiotics in animal husbandry must also be taken into account when it comes to the labeling, and it must clearly indicate it. This is so important as mass preventive administration of antibiotics in animal husbandry to compensate for the poor welfare of animals causes multi-resistances that already cost the lives of 1 million people worldwide every year, and the trend is rising. In addition, we need information on whether or not the food for the animals is genetically modified or if herbicides were used. Furthermore, my concept consists of 3 levels, which makes it easier to understand for the consumers. And this label is so important as we urgently need a systematic shift away from factory farming towards less unhealthy meat consumption. Consumers should be able to see at first sight that they could harm the environment and themselves with a product and do nothing for animal welfare. Last but certainly not least, the third proposal that I think needs to be addressed better yesterday than today is to protect children, but also parents from marketing of unhealthy food. Therefore, we need a ban of advertisement of unhealthy products for children and a clear labeling of these products. This will also help parents to make informed purchase decisions regarding their children. As a member of the Special Committee on Cancer, I had a lot of hearings on the causes of cancer through unhealthy products and the association between childhood obesity and cancer risks later in life. The past years showed that voluntary agreements by the nutrition industry to restrict children's exposure to the marketing of unhealthy food did not work at all. It is still allowed to lure children and teenagers into unhealthy products, to let them become addicted to sugar, which is detrimental for their health, by using celebrities or beloved cartoon characters. Not only children, also their parents are deceived by false claims on the labels. I have to say it here very clearly, rather than supporting marketing strategies of the food industry and helping them to sell better their products, politicians should help consumers to make informed choices and protect especially children from harmful carcinogenic substances. This requires a change of laws and regulations soon. And until this legislative change comes into force, we need a clear Europe-wide labeling system. And it is true that in the end, it is the consumer who decides, but she or he needs to have transparent and upfront information in order to do so. And that is where we as politicians need to act. Having told you what specific proposals I would like to see and the reasoning why we need them, I unfortunately have to tell you that I think that we will not have this regulation before the 2024 elections. Even if the proposals will be presented in some month, let's say in September, there will never be enough time to finish them before the elections of the next parliament. And to say it very bluntly, there are too many interests from industry influencing politicians and member state representatives delaying and blocking the proposals. So in my opinion, it will take many more years before we will have the labeling consumers are asking for. And to conclude, the labeling of products, of course, can only be part of the solution. In the end, we need a holistic concept where the nutrition label is one part in the overall picture, as we need also to promote healthy lifestyle, and we need sustainable food consumption, including educational concepts. But when it comes to labeling, all consumers have a right of transparent information and full information about products, and we as legislators should guarantee this right. We also have to protect vulnerable consumers and need to strengthen even more consumer protection. And looking at the climate and biodiversity crisis and animal welfare violations we are facing, we need to encourage an even more sustainable production and consumption. A certified label definitely would help here. So thanks again for organizing such an event in order to push the Commission to come forward with this necessary legislation.
MEP Manuela Ripa, thank you so much for your reply. I'm sure that there will be some questions for the Q&A session, but next I'm going to direct the question to Olga Kiku. Olga, who are the biggest allies and who are the biggest enemies of mandatory food labeling in the context of climate, environmental costs, and animal welfare at the EU level?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Before going into more in depth talking about the animal welfare label, which is of great interest to us, I would like to say a couple of words regarding the so-called sustainability label, sustainable food labeling, that is very much in the discussions right now, which we feel that is such a broad term that may entail a lot of greenwashing, green and welfare washing, because of so many criteria that actually will have to go under such a broad label. But now going back to the question, well, allies and enemies. Well, I'll start with the allies, of course, and the allies are the citizens and consumers, civil society organizations. We've seen, especially in regards to an animal welfare label, that during the Eurobarometer study, the most recent one was from 2016, an overwhelming majority of citizens consider animal welfare to be very important and that it needs to be better protected. And actually more than half of them said that they are already ready to pay more for products that are more welfare friendly. However, what hinders them seems to be a lack of information, a lack of choice in the supermarket, and also high cost. So while many consumers care about animal welfare, many of them, though, are not very familiar with animal welfare standards and specifically animal production, and they lack transparency. So the transparency that is needed in the system. So therefore, citizens are not really aware of the actual conditions that animals are raised in. Therefore, for this reason, a label that is that looks at the method of production is very, very important. We actually have seen an increase in the number of citizens who want to have more information on the welfare afforded to animals during the production process. And when we compare the 2006 Eurobarometer with the 2016 one, we have seen that the trend is actually rising. And a more recent actual survey, besides the Eurobarometer, a more recent survey on fish welfare found that 70% of respondents knew nothing or very little about the welfare of fish, for example, in their countries. And more than 80% would like to know more about labels on fish products. So this is another indication that citizens want to have more information and they would support a labeling system. And of course, other allies we've seen in the parliament, there's a working group on animal welfare labeling in the intergroup of a group of MEPs. And they have a manifesto and they call for mandatory multi-tier labeling scheme for all animal-derived food products, including processed food and retail and out-of-home consumption. So, so these are some of the supporters, let's say, and the allies, whereas for the enemies, I'm afraid that I will have to list here the member states because of the mandatory nature of the label. In 2020, during the German presidency of the Council, there was a questionnaire sent to member states, and about 25 of them replied, and 92% of member states consider a harmonized EU-wide animal welfare label useful as a measure, but 75% do not support a mandatory EU animal welfare label, although mandatory labels can lead to improvements in animal welfare. So a large majority are in favor of the label. They did say that it should have its own logo and go beyond minimum requirements, and the criteria should focus on animal welfare, and it should exist alongside other existing labels, but it should not be mandatory, and this is crucial here. Unfortunately, this is not the case with the member states, with the majority of member states. Therefore, we consider them on the enemy side here. Another category could be the producers. Because we generally see that those producers who perform well, be it on animal welfare or sustainability, are willing to label their products and to show that consumers, to show the added value that consumers can give to these products. But those who score low are much less willing to actually join these labeling schemes. So in this case, for example, in the case of animal welfare, we see that most products in the supermarket shelves come from intensive animal farming. Therefore, it would be those producers who would not want to see the label would be the majority, because most products actually come from intensive animal farms. Another category, of course, is to go further, the big agriculture industries, because transparency in the food system, unfortunately, is not in their interest, and they're on the side of the enemies. So more or less, this is the case with the friends and the allies and the enemies in regards to labeling.
Okay, thank you so much. And there's already one question for you for the Q&A session, but I would leave it for later. My next question will be directed to Dr. Joanna Swaip. As part of the Sustainable Food System initiative developed by the European Commission, one element of the legal framework is to be a label that conveys information to the consumer side about the sustainability of the product. What information should be provided to show the true environmental, health, and animal harm costs? And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you also for the invitation to participate in this this evening. It's a good question, and I have to admit that I'm more than a bit skeptical about the introduction of any sustainable food labeling framework. I mean, taken at face value, the idea of empowering consumers to make sustainable food choices, it sounds great. It really does sound good. But the question is, who is going to actually determine what is going to be considered as sustainable? I fear that there's a huge risk of any sustainable food labeling being hijacked by industry interests and ending up as a complete greenwashing, or, as Olga pointed out, humane washing exercise, particularly when it comes to animal products. I mean, to be honest, I'm already pretty circumspect about existing independent quality labeling schemes that are making claims about sustainability for animal products specifically, especially when producers and manufacturers are paying to use these label schemes. In the Netherlands, for example, I keep on seeing ads, TV ads, and getting really irritated by them, promoting milk products with the label "on the way to planet proof." I'm not sure whether this label, which I've now discovered is actually a rebranded old environmental certification label, is yet being used anywhere else in Europe. Maybe, you know, others on this panel will be able to confirm if that's the case. The implication here is that the labeled dairy products on the supermarket shelves are being produced more sustainably and are better for nature, climate, and animal welfare. But this actually begs the question to me of what criteria are being used for these products that are able to get the label, and how do they differ from, for example, organically produced dairy products? And just how far is the wool being pulled over the eyes of the consumer who have fallen for this, what I see as a clever marketing ploy? Perhaps I'm being a bit too cynical here. Sure I am. I'm sure that such voluntary schemes do require that producers go beyond the national legal requirements for stuff like, I know, ensuring water quality, energy use, recycling, all that kind of stuff. They may even go so far as to ensure that farmers devote attention to stimulating biodiversity or protecting nature on their land, or implementing animal welfare standards and practices that go beyond the legal minimum. Yeah, I'm trying to be open-minded here about this. But to me, there's a fundamental problem with labeling milk and other dairy products as being on their way to planet proof, or however you wish to portray their sustainability when one considers the pure nature of animal production. Let's first consider animal welfare. I mean, in conventional dairy cattle production, cows, which can live for more than 20 years, they're required to give birth to one calf a year and are typically slaughtered after 3 or 4 10-month lactation periods because their productivity drops. They can live to 20, but they generally don't. To me, that doesn't seem particularly sustainable. Worse still, calves are generally separated from their mother shortly after birth, which causes severe distress to both the cow and calf. Male calves, which are economically less interesting, are either shot after birth or raised in suboptimal welfare conditions for the production of veal. How sustainable or planet-proof is it really to extol the virtues of the products from a production system that fundamentally fails to protect animal welfare by failing to allow mother calves to suckle their own calves? And I haven't even yet started on the environmental and climate impact of dairy production. Indeed, if you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food, cow's milk emits 3.7 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilo, as compared with oat milk, for example, that produces just 0.45 kilograms. It's difficult to justify labeling cow's milk as being sustainable when there are alternative products that are environmentally less damaging. The inconvenient truth is that industrial farm animal production is a significant contributor to the production of the 3 most important greenhouse gases influenced by human activity. And as farm animal numbers grow, their emissions are also likely to grow, even assuming efficient growth. Right now, according to a recent Greenpeace report, animal production in the EU emits more carbon dioxide equivalent than all of the cars and vans in the Union combined. We must also not forget that the animal agriculture sector encompasses feed grain production, which requires substantial inputs of water, land, and energy. To be sure, feed crop production plays a significant role in land degradation, including deforestation, which has a profound impact on our ability to sustain vital agricultural resources, including water, and also to produce food. Water pollution is yet another environmental issue associated with industrial farm animal production. Globally, it's a major contributor to, amongst other things, eutrophication, soil acidification, dead zones in coastal areas, degradation of coral reefs, human health problems, the emergence of antibiotic resistance, and the degradation of water supplies. So, to cut a very long story short, I find it very difficult to see how we will be able to facilitate sustainability labeling for animal products without explicitly emphasizing just how environmentally damaging they are. One of the ideas that I understand is being debated is the implementation of a labeling scheme that uses a rating scale, such as a traffic light system, like we heard from Manuela with the Nutri-Score, to help consumers make informed choices. I do understand that the theory of such rating schemes is that they will encourage companies to improve their processes throughout the food chain in order to get a better rating, just as happens with the nutritional profile of foods in the Nutri-Score scheme. Yet, I really can't see how this is going to work for meat, dairy, and other animal products coming from industrial intensive production systems, when the production system as a whole is so environmentally damaging. Just how will it be possible to honestly communicate this lack of sustainability to consumers? And you can imagine that the powerful, almighty animal agriculture lobby are they really going to stand for this? For all of their products being given the most negative rating possible on a traffic light scheme by default? So, okay. What's likely to happen is that smaller steps towards more sustainable practices, such as increasing on-farm biodiversity, will be rewarded by a higher sustainability rating, and consumers will be hoodwinked into believing that animal products produced under intensive systems can be sustainable. This is greenwashing, pure and simple. This doesn't mean that I'm completely opposed to labeling. However, let it be specific to particular aspects of production, such as production under organic rules or animal welfare. Indeed, I do support, as Olga has just been mentioning, a mandatory method of animal welfare labeling on all products containing animal-derived ingredients. And the emphasis here is on mandatory. This could be a tool to show consumers what production systems the animals raised on farm from birth and then right through to transport and slaughter conditions. Consumers could then also see that the Parma ham that they are buying may well have started off with a piglet who was born in Denmark or the Netherlands. To me, that gives greater traceability, greater transparency of the products that we're buying. I think I'm going to leave it for now. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input and for your expertise. And the next question will be directed to you, Alice. So in your study, you write, the EU legislator paid little attention to the issue of false advertising, including under the form of labels. While the Commission takes on this laudatory goal of extending and harmonizing consumer information, there remains room for producers to employ deceptive language and outright false claims. Yet, cleansing the market of false claims should be a priority before even considering creating an additional label, which, if lacking clear informational requirements, may create more confusion. How great is the risk that the European Commission will adopt regulations that continue to mislead consumers, and how can this be prevented? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you for the invitation as well. So I think there's a pretty significant risk that the European Commission will maybe continue on contributing to the proliferation of labels on food packages instead of prioritizing the fight against humane washing. So the European Commission in 2020 announced the creation of an animal welfare label. So not a method of production label, really an animal welfare label. And it is still unclear what this label is going to look for. We'll have to wait until maybe October and later on to have a better understanding of what that label will look like. So there is no sign from the European Commission, at least at the moment, maybe it will change, hopefully it will change in the next few months, that there will be additional measures to fight humane washing. So all those deceptive claims that are made about animals on animal source products. The European Commission so far hasn't committed to making sure that consumers will know the method that is used in the production of animal-based products, which is a shame because such a label actually already exists on shell eggs, but there is no plan to extend such a label on other animal-based products. There is also no plan to regulate the use of terms and visuals used on products originating from factory farms. So there's more to deceptive claims than deceptive labels. So you could have a label, for instance, it's not perfect. The organic label isn't perfect, but at least it relies on clear standards when it comes to animal welfare. So that's one example of maybe an effective label. But then you also have a wealth of visuals, of terms that are being used on food packages. So if you go to the supermarket, and I invite you to really go into the supermarket, and maybe you don't buy animal source food, but just for the sake of curiosity, just walk around and look at what's happening on food packages, on dairy products, meat products. Olga also mentioned processed products. So you have a lot of meat and dairy in products that don't necessarily are presented to you as being meat and dairy products, and see how the animals look like on those products and what kind of terms are being used. And it's usually pretty positive visuals, pretty positive terms that convey to the consumers that those animals that have been killed for the purpose of food have had happy and perhaps even long lives, when the opposite is it's quite the opposite, especially when it comes to industrial farm animal products. And then there's another perhaps shortcoming in the European Commission's plans, which is the fact that there is no plan to regulate commercial speech that's being formulated in advertisement. And I know MEP Ripa has mentioned this. There is also another phenomenon, which is very interesting to witness, which is how the animals are being presented to consumers in ads, in commercials. So, I'm talking about posters in the street when you're at the bus stop. I'm also talking about what you see on TV, what you see on the internet. And I'm talking about, again, the way those animals are being presented to consumers, but also the way meat and dairy products are being presented to consumers. Sometimes it's not necessarily about human washing, but it is really about greenwashing. It is about presenting some fast food, some hamburger from a fast food chain as being sustainable or locally produced, which of course doesn't entail anything from an environmental perspective. So when it comes to advertising, the European Commission has actually suspended the revision of the EU Agri-Food Program. What is the EU Agri-Food Program, you might wonder? It's a program that funds ad campaigns for animal-based products, including products from industrial farms, because the way those funds are being allocated to applicants is that it doesn't discriminate in terms of method of production. So it just, you would typically see, so there's actually a really good example of a campaign that has been running for the past 3 years about promoting pork meat to young consumers. So you see how problematic it is to young consumers in France, in Portugal, and in Spain. And one of the arguments of that campaign was to say, well, the EU has the best pig welfare standards in the world. Now, if you know the Pigs Directive as well as I know it, you would realize that, the Pigs Directive only codifies common practices. It doesn't actually regulate much of anything when it comes to animal welfare. It allows cages for sows. It allows all sorts of mutilations being performed on piglets. Stocking densities are also extremely high. So it's not exactly what consumers have in mind when they think about pig welfare. And yet that's what's being promoted to consumers with your taxpayers' money. If you're an EU citizen, you actually paid for those campaigns. So the European Commission knows that, at least has announced that it would revise the agri-food program, the agri-food campaign program, to make sure that at least it wouldn't fund cheap meat or industrially made meat. So it's not exactly those words that are being used, but it's what you would understand from that document called the Farm to Fork Strategy. But sadly, this revision has been halted. It was supposed to happen this year and it's been suspended. So how can we stop humane washing practices and greenwashing practices when it comes to animal source products? Well, first, interesting action would be making the labeling of method of production mandatory on all animal-based products. And I won't develop on that because I think both Olga and Joe have made a wonderful job at presenting all the benefits of such a label on animal source products. The second is regulating human claims in general. Sorry, I have a bit of a cat problem. Regulating all human claims that are being made on animal source products, especially on food packages. And what I mean by that is, regulatory action, not just incentives, but clear prohibition on the use of certain terms that are used. So basically, the idea would be to prohibit certain terms for certain method of production. So maybe if your egg comes from actually that's not a good example, but if your broiler meat comes from a broiler who has been raised on a factory farm, maybe you couldn't use certain terms such as high welfare or more animal welfare or good for the animals. And same should go for visuals. So we have some regulation on the use of certain terms for eggs and chicken meat, but there is absolutely no regulation in EU law when it comes to the use of certain visuals on animal-based products. So that's how you end up with products maybe not using certain terms, but definitely conveying to consumers the idea that the animals that they're buying were raised on a cage-free or even a free-range or open-range farm, when really it's not the case. And then the second regulatory action is, of course, to regulate advertisement and regulate commercial speech in general, but especially in advertisement. Because as it's been said before by MEP Ripa, those commercials are directed to everyone, including children. It's interesting because you would think, well, the EU doesn't really have the power to regulate commercial speech and advertisement. I mean, on what legal basis? The EU treaty doesn't allow the EU to actually regulate advertisement. Well, actually it does. All the regulation when it comes to alcohol products, to alcoholic products, to cigarettes, to tobacco products, those regulations that you have in each of the member states, they actually originate from EU law. So we could replicate such a regulatory model for animal-based products, especially industrial farm animal products. And for the same reasons, because it's bad for the environment. Well, I mean, first reason, because it's bad for public health. Second reason, because it's not exactly good for the environment. And maybe third reason, also incidentally, it also undermines the welfare of animals, or I would actually say it contributes to a large extent to animal suffering. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe the European Commission still has 1 year to come up with proposals. So hopefully we'll see some of those ideas in the proposals that will be published in the next fall. If not, we still have, the different EU institutions to maybe contribute to making sure that consumers are actually informed in a way that aligns with animal protection goals.
Alice, thank you so much. I can see that we have already a question to you regarding the regulations on the promotion of some products. So we'll go to it after Alex and Peran. So my next question, I'm going to direct to, Axel, my apologies. I'm going to direct to Axel, of course. Axel, as the International Biocyclic Vegan Network, you work to promote animal rights and veganism. You are the creators of the certification system and quality label Biocyclic Vegan Agriculture. How can such a certification support efforts towards a sustainable food system? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important and interesting discussion. I think from our side, what we try to do, we try to go one step further. What we discussed until now was about, for instance, animal welfare. And I mean, when I listened to the explanations Joanna gave about all the problems of animal welfare in general, and this animal welfare in a way cannot be sustainable, this was somehow at the basis of our decision to set up something which can be a form of farming for the future, where we understand that we cannot we need a paradigm shift. We cannot just afford to kill animals for human consumption, for human use, but there should be a new way of agriculture in the future. And at the beginning, it was the idea, when we talk about this, everybody says it's not possible. You need animals for manure, you need animals for soil fertility, you need animal to graze the grassland, and you cannot use it otherwise. You need it if you want to feed humanity. So in a way, this is the big myth which is in the world, and we wanted to show that there is something which is possible, that we can do it in a different way. So it's a much more radical approach in a way, but everybody in the world talks about the need of shifting to a plant-based diet and to get away from agriculture, from animal husbandry, from factory farming, but in general from animal consumption. If we look at the questions that we also mentioned now, if it is climate and the emissions of all the climate or the greenhouse gases, or if we look at the different aspects of the pollution of the soil with the nitrate in the soil from the animal manure. If we look at health issues of antibiotics and medication and germs which are released into the environment. So we see all the arguments why we should get away from this. And what our approach is that we want to support and to incentive farmers to look at a different approach without animals at all, and then to create a plant-based form of agriculture. And for this, of course, it is something that we have to integrate into all discussions. If we talk about a farm to fork strategy on the European level, we talk about many aspects, but we never see the perspective of taking the animals out of the system altogether. Maybe it's a utopian idea, but we also feel that there's a shift. It's not only on the level of climate, environment, health, etc., but there's also a shift on the ethical level, because there's a young generation growing up now. They more and more say, we don't want that animal suffers for my food. And in a way, so this is growing, and we want to from the very beginning, we want to set up this possibility of working in a different way. And now there is a label now which we have developed, the Biosecure Vegan Farming. There's a certification scheme which is quite kind of a professional, which is acknowledged by the International Organic Organization IFORM, which is the network, the umbrella organization for all organic farming movements in the world. So it is really a certification system which is professional, with audit and professional certificate. We come to a point that we say this all is possible. We come to another point now that, of course, if we want this kind of farming, we also can say, well, we can do it in a conventional way, because if you have synthetic fertilizers, if you talk about hydroponics or so, of course, we can do vegan farming in a certain way without manure, without slaughterhouse waste, without all this, with artificial fertilizers. But then we can ask the question, is this sustainable? Can this be vegan? If we look at the biodiversity which is killed by all the poisons, the soil which is destroyed with all the synthetic fertilizers. So this is not a way. So in a way, if we want a sustainable vegan farming, this can only be organic. And for this, we need also this organic kind of approach for creating this biodiversity and soil fertility. And the Biosecure Vegan Standard is a very large document, which you can even read from our website, which gives lots of indications how this can be done. And there are many farms already in the world who work in this way, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes they do it unconsciously already, and they have lots of decades of experience sometimes. So it is a proof that it is possible. But we have another challenge, and the challenge is that the market doesn't know about it. There's no awareness about it. Everybody thinks, oh, I buy a carrot, I buy vegetables, I buy some lettuce. That's vegan. It's not a problem. But how was this produced on the farm? So we have to extend our awareness to the farm, that we see, oh, well, how was it fertilized? Was it fertilized with animal manure, with all the things? And even if farmers buy fertilizers for organic farming, it can contain animal parts, from slaughterhouse waste. So this is sometimes what people don't know. So in a way, we have to come to a very pure way of farming, but the market is not ready for this. We have farmers who are now producing this way, but they have to go through a certification scheme, which is quite costly, which is quite complicated, like organic farming too. And it can be combined, of course, but then still they have to pay money for it. But if there is not a value for this on the market is not ready to accept this label, then we have a problem. And we have farmers who work like this, but they refrain from a certification because they say it is not worthwhile, it costs too much money, it's too complicated. And so what we need is not yet on the political level. Of course, the political level, they should really support this. They should integrate this into the discussion, but we also need it on the private level with the industry, with the food industry. We need partners who say, this is the future. We promote it together. We get it into the supermarkets. So there's this kind of transparency from field to table to say, well, it is possible to have products which are vegan, consistently vegan from the field. And in a way, this is my kind of, desire to communicate this to everybody, to look for partners, to look for supporters who help us in this way to promote this idea, to become more active in this way, to integrate it into the entire discussion. We feel there is some openness already on the public level. We have, especially in Germany, we have a good relationship with the Federal Environment Agency. We start to discuss with Ministry for Agriculture. So there is a kind of opening for it, but we also on the EU level, there are always some contacts in a way to get this discussion running. But I think we need more communication into this way. And if we talk about animal welfare, we must always say, well, the best animal welfare is if we don't have animal husbandry at all. And to see it, we have to always have this as an option in our discussion. I think this is my message for today. Thank you. And I think maybe we have some other possibility to talk about it.
So thank you so much. And I will pass my next question to Peran. How can you as a business support the transition to a sustainable food system, and what role does product labeling play in this? How should business ensure that consumers are informed, and why? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Morgan, and thanks for inviting me to this important event. It's been really fascinating to hear everyone else's perspectives, and I will be skipping some sections that I had planned that have been brilliantly covered by everyone else. So thanks so much for that. So just a little bit about us. Firstly, Upfield is the world's largest plant-based foods company. We produce plant-based alternatives to dairy, so brands like Becel, Flora, Blue Band, and Rama. And our vision is for a better plant-based future, which to us means a transition towards predominantly plant-based diets, with a particular focus on the global north and in countries and regions that currently overconsume intensively produced meat and dairy. So in terms of us as a business, what our role is in supporting a sustainable consumption is that we provide products that have a lower environmental impact than dairy. And I can't just sort of say that and ask you to believe that. That's something that we want to be certain about, so we test that. We conduct really thorough peer-reviewed, ISO-compliant life cycle assessments to ensure we know and track and monitor and measure the environmental impacts of our products. We have strict responsible sourcing policies in place. And through those assessments, we know very firmly that our products tend to have a far lower impact on climate, land use, water use, and many other environmental impacts than their dairy alternatives. They also outperform dairy products in terms of their health credentials for aspects like trans fats, in which we are trans fat free, as opposed to the dairy counterparts. And in terms of how we sort of impact the change, we believe that plant-based alternatives are crucial in the shift away from intensively produced animal products. They allow consumers to continue consuming, cooking and enjoying sort of traditionally important dishes and maintaining sort of a culturally important cuisine while reducing their sustainability impact. So when it comes to labelling specifically, our key focus is to provide sort of accurate, objective information to consumers about the environmental impacts of our products. So with that in mind, 2 years ago, we started launching on-pack carbon labels, which we have an ambition to roll out to 500 million product packs by the end of 2025. And we do these through the peer-reviewed life cycle assessments that I've talked about before. So as others have pointed out, our scheme is one of many, and we don't want that either. We want sort of harmonisation to ensure that we can compare products with each other. It's not going to incentivize anyone if they see our carbon labels next to a product with a different label or with no label, because it doesn't really mean much to consumers when it's done in isolation. So currently, when we've got a situation where only a small number of businesses use the proper means to create environmental or sustainability labels, depending on what your definition is of those, this will not incentivize the transition to sustainable food systems. So this is why, to me, the Sustainable Food Systems Framework is a really exciting opportunity. I do share the pessimism that's been mentioned by some of the other speakers that this won't happen quickly. But it's a fantastic opportunity to arrive at a harmonized label that allows comparison. And I'm going to talk about comparison quite frequently as a really important topic here. So I'm going to come back to what Joe mentioned earlier about traffic light schemes and the fact that those could potentially hide a multitude of sins. For us, we want to be sure that consumers can look at two products on a shelf and ascertain the environmental impact of one versus the other through direct objective comparisons. The potential is that there might be some sort of traffic light scheme where the categories within which you compare are drawn based on composition, based on the food's ingredients rather than their function. So that could be the form of, for instance, dairy products being categorized within the same category, as is the case with current product environmental footprint category rule pilots, and then placed in a separate category with their plant-based alternatives. Now, why does this matter? Why do we care about which categories products are placed in when it comes to on-pack environmental labeling? We care because it has a potential perverse outcome when you look at consumer behavior. So if I were a consumer looking at a supermarket shelf, I could see a plant-based product that might be worse in class, and let's say it's got 0.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions, and that would have a big red logo based on a traffic light system. And that could be directly next to a dairy product, which is best in class, which could easily have double the emissions, but because it's best in class, that would have a big green logo on the pack. And now, because those categorizations don't reflect purchasing decisions, no one would have any reason to suspect that those two things are in different categories. So you could easily see a quite unsustainable product next to a more sustainable product, and the labeling looks like it's the other way around. So that's one thing that I think we really need to watch out in the upcoming sustainable labeling component of the Sustainable Food Systems Framework. And as I think Olga mentioned as well, it does leave a lot of room for greenwash and hijacking, depending on which environmental and sustainability impacts are considered within an on-pack labeling scheme. So that needs to be widely consulted and evidence-based. So, and in terms of the impact on consumers, then we really must make sure that any labeling scheme that we implement reflects consumer purchasing behaviour. So, for instance, if I go to buy bread, I can choose between bread made from rye and bread made from wheat. those two are directly comparable, and so are plant-based and dairy products, and that needs to be reflected in an on-pack labelling scheme. However, it is a really, if we can get those things right, it's a really exciting way to propel the transition to sustainable consumption. And then on the topic of categorization and comparison, I think this principle can be taken much more broadly than just labelling. We need, for instance, a public procurement scenario in which you can have plant-based dishes alongside animal-based dishes so that people can see that one can be substituted for the other. They are directly comparable. And in doing that, you incentivize sustainable and plant-based consumption. So then moving on from specific labelling schemes, another really important point to talk about when we talk about product labelling and its impact on plant-based consumption, sustainable consumption, is denominations. So this is a topic that I imagine many people will be familiar with, and it's something that we're seeing across many member states and many countries outside of Europe as well, that we get these frequent proposals to limit and further restrict the things that plant-based products can call themselves. So, for instance, we already have in the EU a ban on the use of dairy terms for plant-based products. So things like oat milk or vegan cheese are already banned, and there are lots of proposals to introduce further restrictions to add qualifiers and caveats, and to introduce new restrictions for plant-based meat alternatives as well. Meanwhile, in the US, we've just heard from the FDA that they've endorsed the idea that terms like oat milk and soy milk do not cause a problem for consumer understanding. So we now have this odd situation where in the US, it's very clear that consumers can understand these terms, and in the EU, we're still fighting, and we're increasing our fighting about whether to increase our current restrictions on these terms. And essentially, it's a really important component of how we sell our products. So why am I talking about what we call our products? Does that really matter to consumers? Yes, it does. We can see a lot of studies that will show you that making a sort of a product denomination less appealing by using sort of more technical words, by banning terms that are commonly used by consumers like oat milk, like vegan cheese, those will make it less appealing for people to transition to plant-based foods, and they inhibit the transition to more sustainable diets and sustainable food systems. And frankly, we should be beyond the point of trying to restrict the sale and marketing of plant-based foods, instead in favour of animal-based foods. We should now be working towards integrating plant-based foods into our food systems and our value chains, and helping farmers transition towards plant-based production. If we don't do that, we risk putting sort of untenable pressure on our agricultural land, our water systems, and our climate impact. I think I'll leave it there. Everything else I've said has been fantastically covered by the others.
Thank you so much. And our last question before we move on to the Q&A session will be directed to Ronya. Ronya, what is the situation with naming in the EU food market for ethical vegan successors to animal products? Could censorship of the kind already voted in France, which bans the terms steak and sausage for plant-based equivalents, extend to other EU countries? What implications does this have? I think it's a nice smooth walk from what you, Perrin, has already said.
Yes, hello everyone from me as well, and I'm really sorry that I was late, and I'm also really sorry to have missed the contributions of the other speakers, but yes, Perrin has already kind of started mentioning the denomination issues that we're currently facing. And yeah, the situation for naming plant-based alternatives to animal products can be quite difficult currently, and challenging when, yeah, it doesn't have to be, or it shouldn't be. We have labeling restrictions in the entire EU, as Perrin said, for plant-based dairy alternatives. So as a producer of plant-based dairy, providing foods, that serve the same purpose and function of a dairy food, you're not allowed to name or label your product as soy milk, for example, or almond yogurt, as these terms are reserved exclusively for animal-based foods. We saw attempts in the EU regulatory process to introduce similar bans also for meat alternatives, and even more restrictions actually for dairy alternatives than were already in place. And when both of these initiatives failed on the EU level because decision makers decided against it, the dispute kind of moved to the national level, and not just in the EU, but worldwide actually. So indeed, shortly after the meat terminology ban for plant-based meat alternatives was rejected in the EU, France introduced its own law against meat terminology for veggie meat alternatives. And we also recently saw that the Czech government issued an interpretation of EU food labeling regulations in the form of guidelines for plant-based alternatives, which is particularly interesting because governments or other state administrations are actually not in the position to make such binding interpretations of law. This is something that only courts can do with regards to a specific case. And so the Czech government kind of acknowledges that also. So they're kind of saying, yeah, those are just some non-binding guidelines. But in any case, this kind of builds a threat scenario for anyone not complying with these non-binding guidelines, because it is questionable, you know, what will happen to me if I am not complying with this, and if I'm using terms that are not allowed as it said in the guidelines. And those Czech guidelines are in part a continuation of what was attempted years ago in the EU with regards to more restrictions for dairy alternatives, as they state labeling such as soy alternative to yogurt, for example, is also not allowed. Additionally, terms such as not milk, so even, you know, referring to the alternative as not being the animal product, is not allowed, and some terms related to tuna, eggs, and honey are not to be used in the future as well. The means of guidelines are also used in other countries. So in Germany, there are guidelines for the labeling of primarily meat alternatives, which are also not exactly banning anything, also because they're not legally binding, but which introduce kind of overly complicated circumstances in which meaty terms can be used for plant-based alternatives. Similarly, Belgium is also working on such guidelines, which could potentially, we'll have to see, put an end to current labeling practices as they are used. And we are also talking about this a lot because there are a number of important implications with these kind of initiatives. It could be made much more difficult for consumers to find and identify plant-based alternatives to animal foods and products at times where we should really encourage people to shift away from heavily animal product-centered diets. So these kind of initiatives are going backwards instead of forwards. B, there is a danger of an even greater market distortion than there currently is already. We already have regulatory differences at times for animal and plant-based foods, for example, in which both are taxed differently. But creating this regulatory and guideline-based patchwork within the common market of the EU also hinders intra-community trade, and the legality of that is actually also highly questionable. We cannot have, you know, a decision against the regulation on EU level and afterwards countries, you know, just starting to reintroduce it the way they wanted to. Additionally, this is also fatal, or is a fatal economic signal really to the industry against innovation and more sustainable alternatives. And lastly, it kind of also gets the ball rolling for more and more regulations and countries following suit, to the point that you'd really have to fear that with each new government, new restrictions are set in motion, and And yeah, as I already said in the beginning, is also kind of already happening, as we're not only witnessing these issues in the EU, but worldwide. Australia issued recommendations restricting the use of meaty names for plant-based products upon concerns from the meat industry. South Africa imposed labeling bans, which in the end even led to Woolworth's egg alternative, Just Egg, to be taken off the shelves entirely. Turkey took plant-based alternatives to cheese off the shelves by banning anything non-animal that resembles cheese in any way, prompting factory inspections and potential bankruptcy of small alternative producers there. And in the US, some states restricted plant-based labeling, and more regulation for dairy alternatives is expected there too. And then this is not exactly directly correlating with labeling issues, but the most, I would say, famous recent case was Italy banning cultivated meat, indeed banning actually a future product, because there is not one authorized cultivated meat product currently on the market in the EU, because they first have to go through food safety assessment by the EU authorities and institutions. So we don't even have it yet, and already a country has banned it in the EU. And yeah, all in all, we do also believe that these initiatives are forced onto consumers and the market by an industry defending their unsustainable and harmful interests, really against progress and innovation. And that's why, yeah, we're trying to make everyone aware of that and see how we can change it for the better.
Rania, thank you so much, and thank you so much to all of you for your answers. We'll now move on to the Q&A session. And to those who are watching us, I warmly invite you to send us your question, and if it's possible, please specify to whom the question is addressed. And we have already some questions gathered. The first question is, do we have any reliable tools that we can effectively protect the citizens from the greenwashing and humane washing in labeling? Are the European Parliament and the European Commission aware of this raising problem? And if anyone would like to take this question, please, MEP Ripa.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all the very interesting contributions. And I would like also to add some things, especially to Joe, who was so skeptical on labeling. But first, I would like to answer the question, because this is something, the greenwashing, that was not raised at today's meeting. On the 22nd of March, the Commission came up with a proposal on tackling the misleading information on environmental claims and whatever. So we have a directive here who want exactly to tackle false environmental claims. And I put a lot of hope in that one. And I'm hoping very much that it's not too much greenwashed or watered down by different interest groups. But to answer the question, yes, the Parliament and the Commission are aware about greenwashing that is happening at the moment, and they are taking measures to tackle the problems. And regarding consumers, at the moment we have labels that work, like the organic food labeling. Maybe it's not 100% perfect, but it is a labeling system with clear criteria where we have more animal welfare, and where the consumers can have a look, and if they buy this, they can be sure that it is organic. I mean, I would be always careful where the product comes from, but with this EU label, they have some certainty about that one. And just one point regarding Joe, who was so skeptic about labels, I just wanted to mention two examples that labeling can work. We have two examples in Germany. That was the one with the egg production, when they put on that the eggs were done in cages. It was done by numbers, not even pictures. The cages in Germany were banned very faster than politics wanted. And the second thing is, it was a unique situation in Germany that discounters went ahead and having a multi-tier label on meat products, where you have 1 for factory farming and 4 for organic farming. And the good thing about this was that these discounters were saying that in 2027, I think, they don't want to have any products anymore with a 1, meaning with industrial animal farming. So this is already a way ahead, you know, there is some light in at the end of the tunnel, is discounters already get rid of very bad factory farming. And the German Minister of Agriculture is taking this up. Unfortunately, he's taking it from the wrong direction, because in Germany, a 1 is a very good grade and 4 is a not so good grade. So I think it would be better to have a new system instead of taking the system of the discounters. And Olga mentioned the working group on mandatory animal welfare label. I was also part of this working group. We had a proposal for the Commission that is coming up, hopefully with a animal welfare label, even if I think animal welfare is the wrong nomination for this, because we don't know what animal welfare is, but we should have an animal label who's showing where these animals are kept. So I keep it for the moment like this. Last example, tobacco. There we have warnings, picture warnings of the health problems that tobacco can cause. So certainly we can also have this on meat products.
Joe, if you'd like to add something here.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, 2 things. One in response to the initial question, and one in response to what Manuela has just said. Yes, the EU egg marketing rules have been incredibly helpful in order to identify what eggs are coming from what production system. And in fact, it's also a very good way of tracking. We can see, because of those marketing rules, how many hens are still being kept in rich cages because of those marketing rules. So we know, for example, that in Germany, you're nearly complete with a transition to cage-free egg production. I think the last figures I saw was around 4.8% are still in enriched cages, and the rest are either barn, free range, etc. So yes, it can have a very good function if consumers are also aware of what the egg stamps actually mean. And that's the second point with the meat labeling in the Netherlands. There's a similar system in conjunction with the National Animal Protection Organization. And, you know, from different stars, 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, it's called Beter Leven, which is better life labeling. The problem is with it is that it's kind of like an unintentional greenwashing, because consumers will assume, just because it's got 1 star on it, which really isn't going very far beyond the legal requirements, that it's great, that they're really doing their best. Well, ultimately, we should only be wanting the ones that have the, you know, the 3, 4 stars, which are kind of going the full way. Organic labeling, again, I think you're correct with that, is that you do actually have, because there's a very clear certification scheme and rules, it's much easier to think, okay, you know, if it's met all the audits, then we're fairly certain this isn't greenwashing, because there are very, very strict requirements there. So labeling can have a function. It's just the problem is who is making the definitions. And when you're getting a system like the one I was discussing on the way to planet proof, it's kind of like, well, yeah, not saying they're not making any environmental improvements, but the question is, what exactly, and what does that mean? How can the consumer really, I couldn't really find, and then I didn't do a deep enough dive, I admit, I couldn't really find a lot of the criteria relating to milk production, which was kind of unfortunate, because if I can't find it instantly, then no other consumer is going to be able to either, which does kind of, you know, make me concerned about the accessibility to information. As regards the question on the Commission, the Parliament are aware of this, I think, yes, very much so. I think the problem that you have is, and I hate to use the word schizophrenic, but you have this kind of 2-sided responses within both institutions. On the one hand, you know, if you're talking to the environmental folks and climate folks, they're very well aware, but then, you know, you also have parts of the Commission and certainly parts of the European Parliament, primarily the Agriculture Committee, which is very much kind of facilitating the status quo and is keeping that whole debate going. That's how we got the whole thing with the veggie burger ban, and that's how we got stuff with the milk product names a few years ago, is that these were proposals coming from within an institution, from specific individuals who weren't necessarily representing the interest of all citizens. They were representing the interest of industry. And it was only because it went into the plenary vote where other MEPs were convinced of the idiocy of what was being proposed and that consumers weren't confused at all about these products, that these things got kicked out. And it's a constant fight and a constant tension between the two. So yes, in the institutions, they're aware, but on the one hand, as say, one hand is facilitating, the other hand is being helpful. And there's not much consistency, not much joined up thinking there either, which is, I think, one of the most problematic issues.
Olga, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I think I would say that in regards to greenwashing and beautifying reality, I think everyone is involved in this more or less, and the institutions, the EU institutions, are no exception. I remember a few years back when the building of DG Agriculture in Brussels had pictures outside, and I think some of them still remain, and inside, of course, posters of animals out in the land, out in pasture, having a nice life, looking pretty, and it was all very much this ideal view we have of farming, which has no connection to reality whatsoever, because the vast majority of animals are not do not spend their short lives like that. So it is important to actually take a look at everything we do, and the EU institutions are not excluded. It's not only industry that engages in this kind of, in creating this perception, but it is also ministries, it is also the EU institutions, it is, many others who do that. So I think we need to have a more comprehensive view of actually what we are doing in terms of, both labeling, but also advertising, and the portrayal of farming as compared to what is actually really happening, and what the real situation is in farms, which are certainly, the situation there is not that transparent at all.
Olga, we're going to stick with you for a bit. I have one more question to you. It is in regards to what you said in the beginning. Why is there so much opposition to mandatory or harmonized labeling among member states?
Because, the simple answer to this would be, and the short answer would be because it is not in their favor to actually expose, the real farming conditions. And by having a mandatory label, it would mean that everyone would have to participate, and the good farms and the bad farms. And unfortunately, the so-called, bad farms are the majority of them. So they wouldn't really want to actually rank so low on the scale to actually, present, the picture of what is actually happening to animals. And in general, I think also another factor is the fact that the ministries themselves are much closer to farmers than they are to their own citizens, who care much about animal welfare. So therefore, they want to protect farming interests because they are lobbied by them to a big extent, and it is not in their favor to actually present, to let everybody know, to open, let's say, the farms, to let everybody know what is happening inside the farms.
And the next question I would put on the table for anyone to pick it. How likely is that regulations such as we have for alcohol and cigarette advertising will be introduced for animal products? How much time are we talking about before this becomes a reality? I very much encourage you.
Is this a question for me?
It can be. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have no idea because I haven't even seen that in policy proposals. So I don't know, but I think it's pretty encouraging to know that the EU originally didn't have that power to regulate on commercial speech when it comes to alcoholic beverages and tobacco products. I mean, if you look at the treaty, I mean, it's a bit of a boring legal analysis, but if you look at the treaty, the EU didn't have that power, and yet it took it, which goes back to the point that Olga was making, which is, well, I mean, companies are just being companies, and what's interesting is, or what's interesting to pursue is to have the regulators regulate those companies, and in the case of commercial speech on products that are harmful to public health, but also to the environment, because, you know, we have the Green Deal, supposedly. I mean, the European Commission is apparently willing to make sure that the EU reaches climate neutrality by 2050. Then it would be interesting to see how much the EU is willing and able to replicate what exists for harmful products, what already exists for those harmful products, and replicate it for meat and dairy products. And an interesting example, and maybe a precedent, would be the city of Haarlem, which has banned the advertising of industrial meat products. So, you know, when institutions want, they actually can, and they find the legal basis to make it happen.
Joe, you were first, and then MEP Ripa.
I would absolutely love to see animal products carrying the same kind of disease warnings as you'd see for cigarettes, for example. I mean, you know, but to me, it's likely to be a lot grayer than I am right now before that actually ever happens, if that ever happens. Because what we do see on a routine basis when you're dealing with in the policy field, in the political field, every single mention that is put forward in parliamentary reports, for example, and it was quite remarkable that in the farm to fork strategy, there was any reference, and also in the beating cancer plan, that there was reference to the carcinogenity and the impact of particularly processed meat products on human health. But every time there's any reference to this put forward, the efforts that are taken to quash this are quite remarkable. So while I'd love to see it, I'm really not holding out that much hope certainly in my professional career that that's going to happen. I hope I'm proved wrong, but you know, in the next, let's say 15 to 20 years, I can't see it happening.
MEP Ripa, please.
Yeah, you know, it took ages to fight the tobacco lobby and to get these pictures on the packaging of tobacco and to have an advertisement ban. And imagine in Germany, they can still do advertisement. Even in the EU, it's forbidden. And that is because the lobby is so hard fighting for it. I mean, Olga put it very nicely. She said that the ministers are closer to the farmers and the industry. I would say it's clearly, especially in Germany, a problem of financing of political parties by the industry. I mean, my party does not take money from industry. That's why I also joined this party, because I think only this way you can do real politics for citizens and not for the industry. But this remains a huge problem. And I mean, you talked about tobacco, you talked about alcohol. I was in the cancer committee and I saw how hard they fought, you know, and they're still fighting. And we got clear wording of how harmful alcohol is. And they even changed this wording, even if it was a study done by the WHO, you know, they changed even this wording. So the lobby is incredibly powerful, and politicians, unfortunately, often don't really read things. They just say what the industry is saying. I mean, I was so frustrated by the veggie burger ban, the discussion about the veggie burger ban. We were trying to do a common agricultural policy for the European Union, and the only thing that the media was talking about was this veggie burger. So a veggie burger can be a veggie burger or not. We have to regulate so many important things in common agricultural policy, and all we were talking about in the media was a veggie burger ban. So you see how discussion is going and how difficult it is to change things. So I said we managed to get rid of tobacco advertisement and to ban, let's say, tobacco packaging. I hope we will also manage to do so with meat, but yeah, it will take a long time. And I therefore believe very much in the consumer, an empowered consumer. Always saying the people who are buying have the power because they can decide what they buy, if they want to buy such a product. So they should look closer what they buy and if they really should buy these things. And then we can get rid of many unhealthy products and animal unfriendly products.
Thank you so much. We're going to the very end of the today roundtable. So if anyone would like to add something, last comments, opinions, experiences, this is the exact moment before we're going to end the session. I will wait a little bit more, if anyone. If not, then from my side, I would like to thank all the speakers for your commitment and for your participation. Thank you also to all of you for your presence. I warmly invite you to follow our activities on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. For our social media, we're going to inform you about our upcoming events. A recording of today's session will be available on our Facebook profile. From my side, as a Green REV Institute, thank you very much once again, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.